So chapter 11 will take us through the basic anatomy and physiology of the nervous system. So recall from chapter 1 that we had two organ systems that function in communication. We have the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the nervous system uses a series of electrochemical signals to rapidly communicate directly with other cells and other organs. In contrast to the nervous system, the endocrine system uses a series of glands called endocrine glands to release chemical messengers called hormones into the blood. So the nervous system is a rapid signaling system because the signaling cells of the nervous system, which are called neurons, create these electrochemical signals which rapidly transmit information to target cells. That is, target cells are the cells that are receiving the communication. So the way that the nervous system does this is that it creates electrical signals called action potentials that travel down neuron structures that are called axons. Now, axons are very large, typically very long extensions off of neurons that extend out to target cells or tissues. And these action potentials cause the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters from the end of the axon. Now, the neurotransmitter is actually what crosses the small space or the small gap between the neuron and the target cell and influences the cell or tissue at the receiving end of that axon. So the nervous system, in that way, the nervous system is able to signal rapidly to target cells and tissues. These signals are short in duration because as soon as this neurotransmitter stops being released, the receiving cell is no longer influenced by that neurotransmitter, because typically there are enzymes in the space between the neuron and the target cell that break down any excess neurotransmitter. And so as soon as this neuron stops releasing that neurotransmitter, the enzymes very quickly go to work to break down any remaining neurotransmitter in the space or the gap between the neuron and the target cell, and signaling then stops. On the other hand, the endocrine system, because it releases hormones into the blood, it's much slower to communicate with other cells and organs because the hormones have to be secreted into the blood by the endocrine glands. The blood then has to carry that hormone, that chemical messenger, throughout the entire body, and it takes time for that hormone to move through the blood to its target cell or target organ. The kind of other side of this is that even though the endocrine system is slow to begin signaling, the signals that the endocrine system sends are much longer lasting because the target cells have little receptors on them for that particular hormone. And usually what we see happening inside of the target cell is there's this signal amplification that occurs. And so because of that, when that hormone binds to the receptors on the target cell, there's a signaling amplification process that goes on inside of the target cell. And so this prolongs the signaling that the endocrine system is capable of. So even though the endocrine system is very slow to release and transport these hormones through the blood, the signaling effects of the endocrine system are much longer lasting than that of the nervous system. So there we've seen some comparisons and some contrasts between the nervous system and the endocrine system. We'll focus more on the endocrine system when we get to chapter 16 in A&P 2. So for now, we'll just stick to the nervous system. So as stated previously, the nervous system is a communication organ system, and it communicates by creating electrochemical signals that cause an effect to happen or that influence the target cells and tissues. So when we say electrochemical, that implies two parts, right? An electrical signal and a chemical signal. The electrical signals of the nervous system are usually what we're referring to, the electrical signals that we're usually referring to are the action potentials that are created by the axons of the neurons in the nervous system. And these action potentials then end up causing the release of neurotransmitters, which are the chemical part of the signaling part in the nervous system. So the neurotransmitter chemical signals are necessary because this electrical signal created by the axon does not actually cross this small little fluid-filled gap between the signaling cell on the left here and the target cell or tissue on the right here. And so these chemical neurotransmitters are necessary to signal the target cell because these chemicals have the ability to cross these small fluid-filled gaps, which are called synapses, in between the neuron and the target cell or tissue here. It just so happens to be that in this particular diagram here, that the target cell is another neuron and the dendrite of that target neuron is receiving the neurotransmitter signal here. So neurotransmitter chemical signals are necessary because of this fluid-filled gap in between the signaling neuron and the receiving cell. So the nervous system has 2 anatomical subdivisions and 3 functional subdivisions. And so let's take a look at the anatomical subdivisions of the nervous system. So these are just the structures that belong to the nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord and all of the structures that are located within the brain and the spinal cord. So when we talk about the central nervous system, we're talking about structures within the brain and structures within the spinal cord. The second anatomical subdivision of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system includes all of the nervous system structures that are found outside of the brain and the spinal cord. And so these include the nerves, the sensory receptors, and the ganglia. So let's break down these terms for a second, because nerves, sensory receptors, and ganglia might not be immediately apparent as to what those terms are. So the nerves are cord-like bundles of neuron axons that typically extend out to target cells or tissues. Sensory receptors are specialized structures that are associated with, usually with sensory neurons that detect stimuli or changes in the internal or external environment. And so really sensory receptors are just change detectors. And ganglia is a term that we use for localized clusters of neuron cell bodies that are in the peripheral nervous system. So these usually exist as little knot-like bulges in nerves and clusters of neuron axons and things like that, because these are where the cell bodies for those particular neurons are housed. So in addition to the anatomical subdivisions, I mentioned that the nervous system has functional subdivisions as well, and we actually see 3 functional subdivisions. And 2 of these functional subdivisions occur in the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system functions primarily in a function called integration. And so in this diagram here, it says integrative functions and control centers. That's what we're implying here. So we'll discuss what integration and control means for the central nervous system. Meanwhile, the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into the sensory or afferent divisions and the motor or efferent divisions. So let's take a look at these 3 functions right now. So the 3 functional subdivisions of the nervous system from the previous slide here are sensory input, integration, and motor output. So let's take a look at sensory input for a second. So the body has millions of sensory receptors, and these sensory receptors, it's their job to detect stimuli or changes that are occurring either inside the body or outside of the body. And then this sensory information is then sent to the central nervous system for interpretation and processing. So really sensory input, all its job is doing is telling the central nervous system that a change has occurred. It's up to the central nervous system to actually decide what to do about that stimulus or that change inside or outside of the body. So let's take a look at what's going on with integration in the central nervous system here. Now, integration is the process of interpreting and processing that sensory information that's coming into the central nervous system, that is either into the brain or into the spinal cord. So it's the central nervous system's job to process and interpret the sensory information that's coming in. And then what the central nervous system does is the central nervous system decides how to respond to that sensory information. And it uses the sensory input that's coming in and any relevant past experience for that particular situation. So for example, if you're standing near a hot stove and you're cooking, you know that the pans are hot, and if you touch them, they're going to burn you, because in our past experience tells us that hot objects have the potential to burn us. And we had to learn that at some point. We didn't always know that, right? We didn't come into the world knowing that hot objects would harm us. And so we had to learn that from getting burned in the past. And so what our central nervous system is doing is it's using that current sensory input. It's telling us that, okay, it's warm over here. There's a warm object or stove. And past experience tells us that if that particular object is warm enough, it can cause burns and blisters and things like that. And so it can injure us. And so integration is the process of using that current sensory input and any relevant past experience for that particular situation. So that's integration. So once the central nervous system decides what to do about a particular stimulus, we come to the third function, which is motor output. And this is where the nervous system will activate an effector organ. And effector organs are structures that carry out the body's response to a particular stimulus. Now, effector organs can be muscles, that is, it can be skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or it can be a gland of some type. And these effectors will change what the body is doing depending on the particular stimulus that is occurring at that particular time. So that's our motor output. So we've got our three functional divisions of the nervous system. We had sensory input, integration, and motor output. So now we've reviewed that the central nervous system functions primarily in integration and processing the information that's coming to it, and at the same time also issuing commands, motor commands, that will carry out the body's response. The peripheral nervous system functions in a sensory pathway, that is, it's sending sensory information to the central nervous system and carrying motor information away from the central nervous system. So this graphic that we see here is giving us quite a bit of information. So let's go ahead and unpack this a little bit. So these blue arrows and boxes represent sensory input, and the red arrows and boxes represent motor output and motor divisions. So we see that the peripheral nervous system, as we discussed in the previous few slides, deals with sensory input to the central nervous system through the blue pathway here, and motor output in the red pathway from the central nervous system here. So the sensory input is also called the afferent division. So I like to think of afferent as information is approaching the central nervous system so that it may be integrated and interpreted within the brain or within the spinal cord. And this afferent division is feeding information to the central nervous system from somatic sensory nerves. So these are sensory nerves from our skin, our joints, and our skeletal muscles. And it's also feeding us sensory information from our visceral sensory receptors or visceral sensory nerve fibers. And visceral sensory comes from visceral organs like our cardiovascular system, our digestive system, our respiratory system, and even our urinary system. And so these are all visceral sensory pathways that send information to the central nervous system. Now, the motor division of the peripheral nervous system is it's a lot more vast than the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. Now, if we look at the motor division, we see that it's kind of further subdivided here into the somatic motor nervous system and the autonomic motor nervous system. The somatic motor division controls our voluntary muscles, so this controls our skeletal muscles. And the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system controls involuntary muscles, so this is cardiac muscles, smooth muscle, and glands. And the autonomic division is then further subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. Now, the sympathetic division is the division that mobilizes body systems during activity, and this is typically called the fight or flight division. So this mobilizes our body for activity or even survival behaviors and things like that. The parasympathetic division, on the other hand, is called the rest and digest division, and this division is active during rest, and it also promotes kind of normal housekeeping and normal body maintenance during rest. And so the parasympathetic division is often called the rest and digest division because it promotes housekeeping functions like digestion and ridding the body of waste, like through the digestive and urinary systems, while we're at rest. Whereas these systems are typically, like digestive and urinary systems, are typically not active when the sympathetic division is playing a larger role in our activities at that point.